Thanks so much. Hi, guys. So for those of you who weren't here at the to listen to the first session where Andy was a keynote on Tuesday talking about the Content Authenticity Initiative, I thought I would ask Andy to start with just a quick what this is so that we can catch some of the people up.
Thanks, Leslie, I appreciate it. And again, thanks for the opportunity to talk with the larger group yesterday. So I'll give a very brief intro. I'd like to point everyone here to the website, contentauthenticity.org, where there's a number of levels of explanation of what we're doing, including our guiding principles, which are important to understand. They deal with things like privacy, accessibility, and many other aspects we think are key motivating factors for the initiative, and our partners agree. There's also a white paper there to download if you're interested in some of the more technical aspects of the system that we're proposing. The white paper is a good place to start. So the Content Authenticity Initiative briefly was founded about a year ago at Adobe Max in November of 2019. We announced in partnership with Twitter and the New York Times that Adobe would look at ways to add authenticity to initially images, but eventually video, audio, streaming formats, et cetera. And in concert with the Times and Twitter and many others, we convened a summit. Out of the summit in January last year, seems like ages ago, we were actually able to meet in person pre-COVID and shake hands and do all of those social things that we miss now. We basically set a roadmap for ourselves to focus on veracity of media through authenticity technologies. And some people call this provenance. It's the ability to say from creation, for example, capturing an image on a camera, all the way through to publication and sharing on social media. Can we provide a level of transparency through all of these tools that can be carried along, that is adoptable by all of the platforms, so that at the end of the day, a fact checker or a consumer or a publisher would be able to understand who created a piece of media, understand its journey from capture in the case of a photographer, all the way through editing, publishing. And this enables us to continue to develop really interesting, increasingly AI-powered tools of creativity, some of which were rolled out at this year's Max, where we announced the ability to use the content authenticity technology in Photoshop. Photoshop shipped in concert with that announcement with a number of artificial intelligence powered tools. And our position as Adobe is that Adobe and companies like ours should not be precluded or discouraged from developing increasingly powerful AI assisted tools for creativity, but we should enable creators to use them responsibly. And the way we do that is through the Content Authenticity Initiative and its standards. We're doing three things on the team. One is, of course, rolling out some of these early ideas into the Creative Cloud. Adobe has tremendous reach with millions and millions of creative folks around the world. Second is to begin issuing standards that we hope will be adopted by the W3C, ISO, and others. And third, and perhaps most importantly, to do this in combination with a number of partners across social media, publishers, creators, human rights defenders, and many others from NGOs to thought leaders and academia, and build early prototypes with them to see this code actually working in the wild and make it accessible that way to everyone.
One question just to kind of step back, and I'm going to throw this out and have you think a moment, because in my eagerness to get started, I didn't take care of some housekeeping. But one thing just to clarify, in its simplest form, this is both software and standards, correct?
That's correct, exactly right.
I also want to just really quickly thank our sponsors. We have Google, PickRights, Capture, StockTrack, and CDAS, and we thank them for their support throughout the conference. Okay, so back to you. So Andy, so it's software and standards. For the people in the audience, you had said at the session on Tuesday that the software that you all are creating is an open source. So can you talk a little bit about how you foresee this going forward in terms of both creating the standards and making it available to companies to be able to deploy?
Sure, and those are the two pillars of success from our point of view. Is number one, making sure that we can publish standards that can be adopted. And number two, to make sure that when I talk about accessibility in this realm, It means ensuring that the technologies are accessible to small newsrooms, individuals, companies with or without engineering teams to implement. So the openness, which is absolutely essential, comes both in the standards area and also the source code area. So when we talk about standards, some of you may know there are many well-established pathways to have something adopted as a standard by international standard organizations like ISO itself or the W3C. Adobe and our partners have deep relationships with both of those standards organizations. And to me, standards really represent a kind of permanence. So once something is adopted as a standard, no one will go and invent a competing standard, right? This is the standard way to do things. And we're thinking very carefully about adopting existing standards to roll into ours so that there's very little new that's being invented here, and certainly no intellectual property. So there's a level of openness around the standard process that we embrace. On the open source part, Leslie, that you mentioned, this goes to accessibility to folks who want to implement the CAI ideas. And we will go forward and publish an open source implementation of what we call the CAI toolkit. And that is something that not only represents a reference implementation, but in fact is the beating heart of the system that Adobe itself will be running. So this is not example source code. This is the actual code developed in the open with lots of critical eyes on it from a wide array of viewpoints, technical and non-technical. And then once we have the toolkit established, to make sure we have the right documentation and the right implementation pathways. For those of you who are technical, this may be implementing an example browser plugin that makes use of the open source CAI code. And that's really on the transparency side for consumers and publishers. We will do the same for newsroom software, digital asset management systems, content management systems. And for those, we intend to engage very actively with the vendors of those pieces of software as well. So, stopping short of giving someone and everyone the perfect implementation to drop in and run, we're going to go as far as we can to push forward with an open development model and any way we can help folks adopt these ideas.
Do you have an idea of how you think this is going to go forward from timetable? I know you're still gathering to create the consortium. Is that right?
Yeah, so we'll be announcing more about how the partnership model would work. And my call to action in yesterday's talk, for those of you who did not attend, is to visit the CI website and sign up. You can sign up for our newsletter, or you can sign up to explore collaboration with us. So there will be pretty shortly, certainly before the end of the year, a very clear membership model at various levels. There's no payment involved. The idea here is that we want to embrace, as I said, a wide array of viewpoints and industry leadership. In terms of timetables, I'll be a little reticent to share details there, as I am with my boss at Adobe. The truth is we're moving as quickly as we can, but because this is such a critical effort for our various industries, we're being very intentional and deliberate about our milestones. So this is not the kind of software you rush into production or standards that you rush to publish. That said, we've gotten to where we are in less than a year, which is a little self-serving to say, but I think the partners in the CI would agree with me that it represents pretty agile, fast progress towards standardization. And I think, you'll see our next milestones, which should be quite interesting for collaboration with others. In other words, implementation across the Adobe ecosystem, but also with outside collaborators in hardware and software and platforms, certainly next year. And I would hope to say, first half of next year, and much more to follow after that.
Okay, great. Can you talk a little bit about the way that you're going to have people partner? You mentioned that you're gonna set up the membership area, and if it's too soon to talk about that, that's fine. But I'm assuming you'll be working with different kinds of companies in different ways. So the digital asset management companies might be providing information and be part of one group. Stock agencies might be part of another. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, I can talk about that. Again, no particular time frame, but I think if you I feel like an advertiser here. If you sign up for a mailing list, we'll provide much more information as it's available. But the basic idea is as you described, there will be an organization that represents the kind of beating heart of the consortium that will focus strictly on technical standards. And of course, those technical standards have to be developed in service of many industry and individual creative workflows. And for that, we'll bring the CAI itself into those technical conversations from time to time. But the Content Authenticity Initiative will also have a membership model, and that will not necessarily focus on the technical specs, but more on evangelism, understanding, and really spreading awareness and embracing wide sets of viewpoints. So we would invite people to potentially participate in the working groups that represent the standards-oriented work, which is going to be highly technical, but also in the wider CAI, which is more about evangelism, understanding. And we'll also focus in both on user experience, which I get asked about quite a bit, which is, how do you standardize or mandate or build conventions around terminology that works cross-culturally, iconography, and to some degree user experience. So if you're interested in those topics, the CAI, one of the two organizations, will also be happy to have you join us and collaborate. And there's much more detail to come. By the end of the year, we'll have a model set up, but please express interest now and we'll make sure to keep you informed.
Is it too early to describe how you think that content owners and producers what they're going to need to be prepared to supply? If I understood you correctly on Tuesday, a lot of this is about verifying and validating information. And so if I'm planning to adopt this a year from now or whenever it's really ready for prime time, what's the kind of process that you see as a content owner or a content manager, if you will, that we're going to have to put in to be able to verify or validate the information so that it can be a part of the CAI, or it can be, I guess, sealed with approval?
Right. It's a great question. It's not too early. I can't give you a succinct and perfect answer, but as I touched on briefly yesterday, there are two things we'd like to see adopted over the next couple of years. One is the simple ability to pass through content authenticity data that comes into any system, which means don't strip it out, don't require sophisticated fingerprinting techniques to retrieve it, but allow it to pass through the various steps in the newsroom process, for example. The second is to retrofit existing content. So, we don't intend this in any way to require use only going forward. So, for example, in the case of photo archives, we do intend to help an understanding be developed, but also technology to retrofit large photo archives, small photo archives with content authenticity data. In both cases, what we're really hoping to do is have organizations vouch for their content. So even if you don't have a CAI-enabled camera coming into the photo archive or the newsroom or what have you, organizations can have their own signing certificates and vouch for the content that they're publishing or embracing into a photo archive or stock collection, what have you. So part of the open source work will be to provide a toolkit to integrate into those workflows so that existing EXIF data, IPTC, XMP can be sealed, Leslie, which is a great term to use, and stamped with the approval or the signature of the organization who wishes to retrofit content. And then going forward, I think you'll see hardware devices, even consumer devices, begin to implement the CAI in a secure fashion so that carrying through the data through the various publishing processes will be equally important as adding your own organization's stamp of approval.
So this question, tell me if I'm off kilter here, but it seems in a perfect world, it would be easiest to start at the beginning, right? So whoever created the content, putting the information in or initiating that process. And certainly in the photo agency or video agency world, they're working with creators or companies that are producing content and so forth. So that's kind of part one to my question is how do you, if you're representing work that other people have created, can you be the starting point and how would that work? And then the second part is this world has gotten increasingly non-exclusive. So you have many different companies representing much of the same content, or at least there's a lot of non-exclusive content that's been distributed. So can you speak to how you see maybe that working down the road?
Yeah, on the first topic, I think it goes to the definition of trust. And this is an area where I can't say I have the final answer. It would be a level of conceit to say I understand fully what trust means in the world that we're trying to build together. But in one respect, if you trust the publisher or the photo archive or the stock agency, then you may trust that rigorous means were followed to verify copyright, licensing terms, et cetera. So the easiest sort of trust model is, for example, if you trust the New York Times and the New York Times is signing the CAI metadata into existence, then you can reasonably trust that photographers and editors followed the rigorous requirements of the New York Times. When it comes to multiple parties and multiple stock or archives representing information, I think that's a question that I'm probably not qualified to answer. I think the platform and the standard will support any model of, there are things we call pass-through claims that we talk about in our white paper, which simply exist to say, I trust this content, I'm adding my stamp of approval without sealing any other details about what may have been edited or changed. And in that case, any number of parties can vouch for a piece of content. Now, the implications of multiple parties vouching for a piece of content in this world is probably not for me to opine on, but the system supports it. So I know that's a bit of a non-answer, Leslie, but I think we have to talk with, and I would embrace the DMLA's input and individual organizations' input to help us figure that out. But many things are possible. The right thing might be a little elusive to talk about today.
Well, and I don't mean to ask for all the answers because I know you're just putting the groups together so you can figure it out, but I figured I would ask. We do have a question from Tom Smith with Gatto Images, who's also our conference chair. He's asking, how would this address digitized archival content where the origins may not be entirely clear?
Yeah, good question. And thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit more about that. So this idea of a pass-through claim or a voucher claim is saying that your organization, if you have archival content, would say, we vouch for this content, meaning we know where it came from for the most part. Now, there are degrees to which that can be done. For example, in Adobe Stock, we've started talking about vouching for XMP data, which of course is an amalgam of detailed camera information, IPTC tags, EXIF information, et cetera. You could choose as an implementer or user of the CAI technology to decide which parts of that metadata you want to seal and vouch for. And if none of them are reliable, you might just say, I understand and vouch for the copyright implications or the copyright data or the licensing data for this image. And by putting your organization's signature on that data, which is associated with the bytes of the image and the various versions of the image that you might be publishing and licensing. That is a way to deal with archival content without having to know the exact detail of the provenance of the metadata that it might contain.
Yeah, and I would suppose you can certainly include where you got the content from, because a lot of the archival or public domain content will come from places like the Library of Congress, which may not be the origin, but certainly I think is a trusted source. Am I getting that right?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think in this ideal world, we imagine the Library of Congress itself would be able to vouch for content to some degree that it publishes and makes available. But that is correct. So I mentioned this yesterday, there are kind of two classes of content authenticity claims. Claims are the things that cryptographically bundle up the facts that you're asserting about a piece of content. And colloquially, we refer to them as machine-generated and human-generated. The machine-generated ones, of course, are caused by humans. So if you use Photoshop, Photoshop is a trusted piece of software in this case. It can make certain assertions about the content, like an AI tool was used or a synthetic human was added, et cetera. The other type is, oriented towards fact checkers, copyright, any kind of data that you would enter as a human into Photoshop or other tools could also be sealed in the same way with the understanding that this piece was plain text entered by a human being. So in your example, Leslie, you might say, this was attained from the Library of Congress. Here's a reference number that refers to the original, and I'm vouching as a photo archivist or an organization that I personally or my organization got this from the Library of Congress. And that is that imbues a certain level of trust, we think.
So acceptance of this is really going to be key, because then people will start to trust it. The more and more people that implement this, the more people will be able to trust when they're seeing the CAI. I guess from a public standpoint, they'll start to recognize it and trust it. Do you have any sense of, well, I'm actually not going to ask that because it's an unfair question. I guess the trust is a real key part of it. It's interesting, yesterday on a totally separate topic, we were talking about synthetic content quite a bit. And it struck me in several of the conversations, and I think it may have even come up in your keynote a little bit, that, you know, this is not just about verifying what's real content, but understanding what the content is. So in a way, it could be used for synthetic content openly on the front end to say this is synthetic content and not a real person. Do you want to speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's definitely right. And it's something that I don't get enough opportunities to talk about. So thank you for raising it. Yeah, again, you know, one of the many reasons Adobe got into this leadership to convene folks around the ideas of content authenticity in the first place was that we feel strongly that tools for creative usages will increasingly use AI and synthetics, and that should be encouraged, just like editing should be encouraged for good purposes. And if Adobe and other companies are going to continue to invent these very powerful tools, and folks are going to build, you know, thriving businesses like Synthesia around synthetics, they should be empowered to use those things responsibly. And we think that the Content Authenticity Initiative is a way, if not the way, to inject responsibility into these toolkits. So, for example, if you saw something purporting to be news that had CAI attribution, and you saw that one of the CAI attributes was AI tools were used to generate this, you might look at it with a certain degree of skepticism, because that, you know, news content generally shouldn't have synthetic content or AI tools applied to it. Similarly, that information can reveal something about someone's creative process. So if you have something that's not news media, that might be an image generated in Photoshop or a video with synthetics that goes through any video tool. A creator could choose to provide creator attribution, meaning this is mine, I made it, I hold the copyright, I made it using this tool, but they could choose to hide the details of what AI tools were used. And again, you might just apply a tag or some CAI metadata that says AI tools were used in the creation of this thing, to provide transparency if you want to. And again, for those malicious actors who want to use these same tools for non-benign purposes, we would expect to see the dearth of CAI metadata. And again, in the news context, if something didn't have content authenticity, you might look at it with the same eye of skepticism that you would if something had the data and had AI tools called out as having been used. But I think, you know, it is early days, Leslie, and a lot of this is going to be determined and honed in concert with all of our partners in the CAI and the standards efforts. And I think it remains to be seen how people use them, and if this is in fact one or the primary way to inject responsible use into the use of these powerful tools, synthetics being just one.
Well, and you use the word transparency, which is coming up a lot over the course of the last couple of days. And I think, you know, I guess my gut says that editorial will probably be the greatest initial beneficiary of this, because we were having a conversation the other day where, right or wrong, we're sort of used to advertising having a falseness to it, if you will. I mean, we're used to advertising being sort of aspirational or, you know, whatever it is, but we're used to it being sort of crafted, if you will. The editorial, though, as the example you showed the other day, the one of Nancy Pelosi was fascinating, I thought. But there's a real questioning of what you can believe right now. I mean, we've all heard about Facebook issues and Twitter, and you know, I'm glad actually Twitter's involved with this, because I think there's such a question now of what can you believe in the news and on the editorial side of it. So I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that, but do you see editorial as being sort of maybe the driver initially of this, or is that yet to be determined until everyone comes together?
I think the answer is yes. The simple answer is yes. And the reason I hesitated just a moment is because We think the solution that the CAI puts forward is equally useful in creative context and copyright and others as well. But certainly the one that gets the most attention is how can you believe what you see online? And the level of transparency that we intend to inject into images and media of all types definitely is most immediately useful there, especially in the current environment with the US election and disinformation throughout the world. So the answer is yes, I think it will be most useful and probably get the most attention there initially. But I think transparency benefits everyone. Again, very powerful tools coming to market, not just from Adobe, but from so many other companies. And a level of transparency about what was used and how something was made to the degree folks are comfortable sharing is very important, I think, in all of our industries combined. Now, in the news forum, there are a number of problems. Content authenticity addresses one of them. Detection is something that a lot of large companies are looking at. I mentioned yesterday the Facebook deepfake detection challenge, I would say, came up a bit short in terms of what's possible, but really does represent the state of the art and the best research in the world. And there's a hit rate of about 65% of detecting fake videos. I think the training set tended to be about 10 seconds of video. Now, this is a remarkable technical achievement, but 65% at Facebook scale or YouTube scale or Twitter scale is really not much better than a coin toss. So we think content authenticity can also be used to inform those training models so that, with cryptographically verifiable data and the ability to detect, biometrics of people in videos and pixel manipulations and some of the things the Semaphore project is working on, together could really help shield people from inauthentic media. But that's only half the problem. The other half the problem on social media is amplification, especially amplification of things that fit particular user worldviews that may be inauthentic. And there we think that transparency is maybe the only solution, which is to put some tools in the hands of the consumer to understand what they're looking at and make up their own minds. And we have the enviable position as the CAI to say we're not making any judgment calls. We're specifically not tagging anything as fake or real, and certainly not making any claims about the veracity of the things that are depicted in images, for example. But we are saying let consumers decide for themselves. And that has many UX challenges in particular to make sure that the information is presented in a way that is digestible, consumable very quickly at social media speeds. But we do think at the end of the day, putting this in the hands of consumers and fact checkers to some degree is critically important, and that's the main intent. But we also intend it to be used by media platforms to decide what to amplify or not amplify using those algorithms that you mentioned.
So 2 follow-ups, and then we've got another question from the audience. One is Facebook involved in this?
Facebook is not formally involved. No.
Okay. I suspect you want to get as many platforms involved in this as you can. And then the second follow-up question, I guess, is it goes back to, I think you touched on this yesterday as well, but the intent is that this can't be stripped out. But the reality is there will probably be some bad actors that can come in and kind of strip this out. So then does this become something then that you can verify through reverse image search and look, or how do you see kind of the unfortunate reality that you're probably going to have some people that try and break the technology and strip out the data?
Yeah, so except for the stripping case, all of and I'll come back to it to answer your question directly. All of the various manipulations one could attempt are tamper evident, meaning that if tampering is attempted either on an image or a video or the CAI metadata itself, or XMP if we're verifying XMP or EXIF or IPTC tags, that's all detectable, and tools that understand how to interpret CAI metadata would be able to tell a consumer that. In the case of metadata stripping, it's always possible with a hex editor and not particularly sophisticated technology understanding to go and remove metadata from images. All these standards from JPEG to MPEG-4 have well-established open standards for inserting metadata, and those can be used to remove it as well without breaking parsers and such. We do have something in mind, which I touched on just briefly yesterday, around something, content fingerprinting for images that's a little bit more sophisticated than most reverse image searches. But the idea is similar. It's to say with some degree of confidence, a high degree of confidence ideally, can we take an image without CAI metadata and check, through a system that is not unlike domain name search to check various places that might hold CAI claims and reattach them to the image, either at viewing time or permanently. It requires that the claims of the CAI be hosted in the cloud somewhere, number one, which is not required by the system. And number two, a reasonably sophisticated open system for checking to see if a fingerprint matches CAI claims. So we want to stop short of building a gigantic image registry, but if claims are stored in the cloud, to be able to pretty much deterministically reattach them to metadata from which they may have been stripped. This is not a solved problem. It's an area of research. We have some ideas in mind and an early implementation of something that we think is very promising. But it is kind of the primary malicious use case to circumvent the CAI, and we're working hard to solve it.
I would guess this is maybe an area where artificial intelligence could help too. I don't know.
Yeah, so the most sophisticated reverse image search tools do some interesting things with machine learning, like look at objects, the geometry of objects in images, in addition to the image pixels themselves, and then use a heuristic that evolves over time, effectively using AI to match images and become very sophisticated. Those kinds of technologies are hard to open source and deploy widely across organizations because they require training. But we have some things in mind. I don't mean to be overly tight-lipped about it, but we're not quite ready to talk about how this works. And there's a lot of research and experimentation. But I am confident saying that it is possible to reattach CAI metadata in the cloud to images with benign transforms like compression and other things that may have happened along the way.
Very interesting. Okay, we do have a question from the audience, a private question. If a CAI member has technology that may solve some of the challenges being worked on, do they upload their code as open source to GitHub to be vetted by other members? Or do other members looking to roll out a solution work directly with the tech provider to incorporate it into their solution? And then he goes on to say, I'm just wondering how the various members interact when it comes to developing and marketing solutions that ultimately utilize the CAI standards to establish provenance.
A good question. So in terms of the work done on the standards themselves, the idea is that there is no proprietary IP of any kind. Whether require open sourcing something that's not open source, and I know this isn't quite the aim of the question, I don't think that would be the case, but when someone joins to work on the technical standards piece that I mentioned earlier, we would expect that anything discussed or submitted as a contribution would be as open as the initiative itself. So that code would be open source, there would be no IP involved, et cetera. Now, that doesn't mean we want to not work with proprietary solutions or folks running businesses based on some of these technologies. So I would urge you to get in touch with me and my team by sending something into the website form around collaboration. And there may be some ideas that can be incorporated, but at the end of the day, the standards and the open source implementations that we expect people to use to push forward traction on the CAI itself would be all developed in the open, completely adoptable with very permissive licensing from the open source world.
Well, so, this may not be decided yet, but I think part of the question was, is it going to be pushed out there where everyone can access it, or are people going to need to come and work through the CAI? Or do you
yeah, it will be, anything that passes through the standards process and is open source is public. I should have mentioned that earlier.
So it'll be pushed out so people can access it themselves.
Yeah, members may get early access, right? We're looking for a small number of participants to vet ideas and code, but eventually it's all open source, available to everyone who wants to take a look on GitHub. Absolutely.
Let's go back to the process that what you're building, if you can, a little bit. So right now you're putting together, you're asking for people if they're interested to sign up through the website. And what we can do is post that link to the schedule so that people can go directly into this session in their schedule and link that, if that would be helpful. Is that all right with you?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So you're going to put together this group. People are expressing an interest. What do you think some of the most helpful ways that people at this conference, which really combine the distributors, the photo agencies, but also technology companies that sort of, are around this universe. What do you think would be the most helpful way for, information for you to get, and also the way for them to get involved?
There are two ways. As I said earlier, there is the sort of deep technical contributions. We're looking for, as many participants as possible. We think at the end of the day, we'll have probably about half a dozen working groups specifically working to deliver very specific technical specifications. Each working group will have a charter. The deliverables from each working group will be very clear. If anyone's familiar with standards organizations, W3C is a model we take a lot of inspiration from. That's the way working groups will be run. They'll be, rigorously vetted. They will meet periodically, perhaps monthly, but it depends on the working group charter. And they're specifically spun up to produce a part of a larger CAI spec. We think that the bulk of the industry participation will be in sort of the umbrella organization, which will be larger. That's where we want to learn about use cases. And frankly, I think the ways to help are twofold. One, join one of our working groups on the technology side. Two, help us understand your industry use cases by joining the CAI itself, the lighter weight, probably a click-through agreement on the website that'll be up in a few weeks. And again, the way to start that process is just to reach out, get in touch, and make sure to put you on the list. We intend to have events, forums, perhaps a Slack channel, lots of ways for lightweight interaction to understand industry use cases. And above all, to make sure that the standards we put forth and the early implementations and prototypes don't preclude any use cases that might be important to your industry, your company, your organization. And for that, we need lots of input. We don't purport to be experts my team at Adobe is very small. The sum total of CAI founding members and white paper authors is also quite small. We represent a number of industries, but we have a lot to learn about very specific use cases, from newsrooms to camera capture devices to photo archives to copyright workflows, et cetera. So we're looking for lots of participation. I think probably just about everybody here and at yesterday's session has something to contribute on the use case side and the industry depth side. So we'd welcome any input there. And again, the way to get involved is there's an email on the website. You can DM Content Auth on Twitter, reach out to me directly, or fill out the short form on content-authenticity.org. And the team will follow up and get you involved.
Okay. Can you describe a little bit the difference between your role in Adobe and the CAI and how they relate and don't, or maybe don't?
Adobe's role or my personal role?
Well, I'm really thinking not about your personal role, but how Adobe and the CIA are interacting, because they're separate, correct? CAI is independent, and yet it's obviously a part of Adobe too.
Yes, I have to call out one thing that I do all the time. Leslie, you said CIA instead of CAI. I do it, and folks on my team do it, and it's interesting because I've often been introduced as the director of the CIA, which I am not, just to be clear. Let's see if a lot of people.
Not the first time I've done it. I will not promise that it will be the last, but I apologize. The CAI, yeah. Yeah.
So that aside, that's a great question. So to date, the Content Authenticity Initiative has been 100% led by Adobe, and the partnership agreements and collaborations we've done are agreements between Adobe and those partners. The next phase, which was always intended to be in place after the white paper, which we published in August, which we hope to have in place by the end of the year, as I mentioned, is a true consortium where Adobe will be on the steering committee, but there will be a true consortium of members. Again, Adobe will continue to lead, fund certain parts of the effort, but that will, in the service of issuing standards, this will be a much more democratic process, if you will. And then the CAI open sort of membership model I mentioned, where we're looking for use cases and such, will funnel into that technology consortium that will be developing standards. But that will continue to be an Adobe-led effort. Adobe will sponsor the events. Adobe will fund and put on collaboration showcases for folks who are implementing parts of the CAI. So they are distinct, but they work closely in concert. And I think you'll see in the coming months, you'll see other organizations doing similar things, to have an industry interest group, but also participate in the standards work that we're doing.
So what do you think the most difficult part of this is going to be?
I think the most challenging part is adoption. I think writing the standards, ensuring that we don't preclude use cases and scale. I guess in some respects, in many respects, the technical challenges are the easy part. I think the sociological implications and getting broad adoption and traction will be the much more difficult part. And I think maybe the most difficult part of all is to think about the user experiences, iconography, terminology, and education that are all required to make this successful. All of those efforts start with wide adoption and interest. Like any standards effort, this requires, we're doing two things that are odds. We want to go really fast. We want to see adoption. We want to see a component of fighting disinformation be the CAI. At the same time, we want to be thoughtful, intentional, deliberate about the standards and also the implementations so that they are secure, tamper evident, and really ready for prime time before we seek broad adoption. But I think over time, people often ask me, how long until this is ubiquitous and available? Of course, that's an unanswerable question. I say, ask me again in a year. And in the year that between now and hearing that question again, I would expect to make very quick progress towards early forms of adoption, like participation in the standards organizations, wide participation from lots of industries, from human rights defenders to NGOs, to publishers, to stock photo agencies, and many other industries in between. When we think about expanding media types and think about documents and authenticity for documents, you can imagine there are many, many, perhaps hundreds of organizations, individuals that we want to hear from. So I think ensuring that we move forward intentionally and get the adoption we need to see this, ready for prime time and widely adopted in the next few years is probably the biggest challenge. And it has sort of a non-deterministic solution, which means lots of interaction with lots of people, in some cases even including governments, to make sure that this can be adopted and used in the way that the CAI intends. There are many technical solutions that we need to develop along the way. But again, rather than dwell on those, I think the more difficult part are the societal implications and adoption that we would like to make intentional but fast headway on in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I would assume the quicker that people adopt this and the more that kind of information gets out there, then the more it'll start being trusted and being a part of the solution. You mentioned governments, which actually ties into what my next question was going to be. And that is, how do you see the international deployment, if you will? You're US based. Right now, it sounds like most of the organizations involved are US based, but I assume this is intended to be a global effort.
Yeah, on the publishing side, we have early partnerships with the BBC and the CBC in Canada. So I think we have been sort of North American focused in these very early days. A lot of technology companies are based here, obviously, but you'll see increasing membership from throughout the world and contributions from throughout the world to represent both different cultural viewpoints, but also different technological viewpoints, particularly coming from Europe and other parts of the world. So yeah, that's of critical importance. And you'll see, by the way, if anyone is, comes from other parts of the world and would like to be involved, making sure that we have diverse viewpoints is absolutely critical. And I think we need to do better there. It is early days, but that can't be an excuse. So diverse points of view, both culturally, technologically, and in other ways, are something that we really want to embrace, and quickly.
We do have people from Asia Pac and Europe, so hopefully we can get some of them to reach out to you. All right, so let me ask a little personal question. What do you think your biggest challenge is going to be?
And now you're referring to me personally, not Adobe.
You personally, right. You already answered that you thought the biggest challenge was going to be getting adoption going and getting it going quickly enough. And it may be the same, but I am curious. I mean, you're in sort of the Wild West kind of territory with this. So I'm just kind of curious what you see your biggest challenges.
Yeah, it's a great, there are many. You're hard pressed to find one to put at the top of the list, but since you have me on the spot, I would say I have a lot to learn. So I'm delighted to be here talking to all of you. Each of you is an expert in a way that I certainly would not purport to be. So in the areas of copyright, photo agencies, archival companies, and beyond, to things in computational photography that are more technical that I have a passion for, but I'm by no means an expert in. It's my role above all the other things that I do, and that are part of my role in the CAI, is to make sure I know what I don't know. And in that way, we need lots of industry expertise, companies, individuals, academics, to not teach me what they know, because that would be unachievable, but to make sure that we know where our blind spots are and we know where to seek additional expertise. And not a week goes by that I don't realize that we have not incorporated expertise from a certain area or industry or company. So if nothing else, I want to leave you all today with the humility we have on the CAI, and that I have myself, that there are lots of things we have still to learn. And in service of the goal I mentioned earlier, is to not preclude any use cases that are important to your industries or any other, but also to make sure we're having early conversations and frequent conversations with experts who complement our own. And that is not necessarily straightforward, because again, you don't necessarily know where to look for knowledge that you need if you don't know you need it. So I encourage people to reach out and tell me what we don't know. That's the best way to move forward.
It's one area I think I'm excited about for DMLA getting involved with you all, because I think we can help in some of those areas. We have a tremendous legal committee, which I don't know if you were able to see their hot topics in legal, but it's a broad group from different companies, different sized companies, so they may be able to help on the copyright. But it makes me then ask a follow-up question on issues like legal issues. Do you foresee any big stumbling blocks? In particular, I think of Europe, but I would think this is going to be a positive, so maybe not. Maybe this actually helps many of the issues that we face around copyright and so forth. But any thoughts on that yet?
Yeah, so I mean, there is a group at Adobe that is well versed on the CAI and works with policymakers both here and abroad. I see many familiar faces here today. And I've talked to some of you about Article 15 and Article 17 and the potential relevance of CAI. I do think that this can only be helpful. And if legislation helps adoption and traction, all the better for CAI members and folks who believe that this is an important solution to get out there. But at the same time, we don't have any opinion or agenda in terms of legislation forcing adoption. We have the general healthy regard for legislators and government getting involved. But in this case, I would hope that content authenticity is something that technology companies and all the other industry sectors I mentioned could kind of figure out for ourselves. In the case of where legislation is required or comes to be, we'd like to have a seat at the table to make sure that there's awareness of the CAI. But beyond that, and I think we're gonna be largely agnostic in terms of legislation around these items. And I think it can only help, as you said, Leslie. So awareness is the key initiative goal.
I'm curious how you see search engines in this process.
So this data is available to be indexed. So, just like Google licensable images recently rolled out, you can think of this as another type of metadata that search engines can index. Although I am not able to enumerate the various folks we're having early conversations with about working together, we would like to see this embraced by all of them, social media platforms, search engines, so that, for example, in a photo archive search engine or on Google itself, we imagine a day where you might be able to search for images that have authenticity data, or that come from a certain verifiable place, or a photographer, et cetera, or have been vouched for by a certain organization. Even news stories that have media associated with them that come from a certain organization or have some of those other characteristics you might be interested in. And the data is available to be indexed. The data itself is not encrypted. So when we talk about cryptography and signatures, we're verifying that the data hasn't been tampered with, but the data itself is available for indexing, just like IPTC, EXIF, and other types of data. So I don't know where this goes in terms of search engines, but it's certainly available, and there are lots of creative use cases that I can imagine that search engines could take advantage of, some of which I just brainstormed there off the top of my head.
Maybe this is a simple thing that I'm just now catching up on, but whether it's in your internal search or an external search engine, the ideal would be that there is a field that you can search to be able to see that it's a CAI verified image or validated. I'm not exactly sure what the right words are, but that it's CAI compliant, perhaps.
That's what. That's what we say internally. We call it a CAI compliant device, software, or image. So that is correct. Yeah, I think that's the idea, right? This data is available to the index if search engines choose to index it. And I think there are compelling reasons to do so. The data is available, readily accessible.
Is there any message you want to, I mean, maybe this is something you've already said, because I know you want people to sign up and to go, but is there anything you want this group to think about, or any message you want to provide to this group while you've got them captive?
I mean, I'll beat a dead horse a little bit and say, the team would like to hear from all of you. If you have interest in the topic, more questions, or anything to contribute, or if you have interest, I guarantee you that you probably do have something to contribute in one way or another. And the call to action above all else is to get in touch. In a few weeks, we'll have those mechanisms for you to sign up in a clearer sort of membership model that's coming. We're working really hard to get that out there. And again, if you think we have any blind spots from the little bit I've had the privilege of talking about yesterday and today, things you want to talk about, contribute. This is a mission that, number one, it's early days. This problem didn't crop up overnight, and it's not going to be solved overnight. But we want to make sure we don't have any blinders on. We understand the implications of what we're doing, and frankly, the scope of what we need to do. So again, I would encourage all of you to get in touch and help us do that.
We just got another question. Have you looked beyond just creator applications to areas such as the medical industry? For example, for logging which drug has been given at which time, using which tools, and by which nurse or doctor. And then knowing with certainty that information is accurate and unaltered. That's right. An interesting question.
A great question. So, and this is, in terms of medical industry, I would say yes. I think the question is, have you thought about it? The answer is yes. Are we ready to say we have a solution that is applicable? Certainly not. But the medical industry is one that came to us and eventually to me via an interested party who asked that exact question from a position of expertise about current technologies in the medical industry. So, we're very careful about naming the initiative to be the content authenticity initiative, not the media authenticity initiative or something else. Our notion of content in founding, as Adobe in founding this, what will eventually become a consortium, is to make sure we embrace all kinds of content. Adobe has a long legacy of verifying document signatures. So PDFs, everything that Adobe Document Cloud traffics in. And if you follow the news, the last couple of weeks, there was something that came up around an email that became a PDF. The veracity of the information was unknowable, unverifiable. So I'm learning every day from folks who approach us and say, could this be applicable to my industry in this particular use case, but also from just watching the news. Again, not a week goes by that I don't have at least one of each of those incoming use cases, many of which the CI can apply to. And again, if you read the white paper and the standards that the consortium will eventually publish, they do embrace all of these use cases. Now, there's an implication in the question, is this admissible or useful in a court of law? I'm not sure. We would like it to be, but we don't want to have any pretense that that is the initial intent. The intent here is to provide transparency to content consumers. Going beyond that is something we'll continue to explore, but the candid answer is I'm not sure yet.
Well, it's interesting because I think if you find an image that had gone through the validation process and the information wasn't there, I would think it certainly would be helpful to be able to go back and point to the validation, at least for infringement. And I know you and I've talked about this, but I'm not sure if it's come up yesterday or today, but with the companies that are trying to help enforce infringement, or not enforce infringement, but enforce copyright and going after infringers, is there a direct application that you see for them in this? Or is there a way that, do these work together? Are they complementary, or is there something more?
Yeah, so I'm aware of many interesting technologies around going after copyright infringers. Again, I think the CAI can be accretive to those, or it could be adopted by those to be the primary use case. So When I talk about this, maybe being admissible in a court of law, those are questions that I'm not qualified to answer. However, if standard cryptographic techniques and key lengths and the technologies we've adopted to be part of the CAI are admissible and useful in those cases, and I think they are, then I would expect the CAI technologies to be helpful and additive and accretive to those kinds of cases, and hopefully adopted, right? The idea of having copyright tools that help with infringers and adding the CAI as another level of trust and verification is something we would like to see happen.
I do appreciate, because we're asking a lot of questions that I know you have yet to be able to answer and to determine. We have one more question that came in. In the heritage sector, there are a lot of orphan works. Do you have an idea for how the CAI will manage orphan works?
I don't. That would be, so that is certainly something that I'm not knowledgeable in. I would like to learn more about it and hear from Andrea to talk more about it. So the answer is I don't know. I'd love to learn more.
Yeah, orphan works will be an interesting area. I think to some extent, it's got to be similar in some ways to the starting point of where the information comes, because with an orphan work, you don't know the origin. So much like the archival question, but it'll be curious to see how that evolves. So that's another area we may be able to help with. All right, guys, any other, not guys, sorry, that's my time in New York. Any other questions from the audience before we say thanks to Andy and let him go? While we wait and see if anything comes in. I do want to thank you for coming and talking to us. I know you've launched and I know it's out there, but it's still early days. And I'll just reiterate that I think everyone with DMLA is very excited about what you're doing and thinks the notion of bringing more transparency into the image space is just absolutely critical, and what a vital time to be doing it. For those of us that live in the United States, this election is a huge example of just, what's going on and how uncertain people are, as we talked about earlier. So thank you very much, Andy. Really appreciate your time. I will tell people we're trying to start these roundtable discussions on time. You've got 2 minutes to get over to the next one. We want to thank our sponsors again: Google, PickRights, Capture, CDAS, StockTrek. Did I forget anyone, Andrea? Yes, type it in for me. I don't want to forget. I should have written it down. But if I forgot anyone, all our sponsors, I really, really thank you. And I think that's it, Andy. So you're done with DMLA. We really appreciate your help.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to this group and yesterday. And I look forward to further conversations with each of you. And thank you, Leslie, and DMLA.
Oh, and SmartFrame. We got it. We got it. So SmartFrame, thanks to SmartFrame. Okay, thanks, Andy. Thanks, everyone. We're going to end the session now. Take care. Bye.